It was the last day of the harvest festival, and the village had gathered once more in the dusty central square, where the air smelled of sweet spices and fresh fruits. The sun hung low, casting a golden glow over the sea of faces, some old, some young, all expectant. Among them stood Zuri, the last virgin of the village, her presence as much a blessing as it was a curse. The elders looked at her with reverence, their eyes heavy with the weight of tradition, but Zuri could feel their stares were different today, more intense, more possessive. She had always been the jewel of the village, the untouched, pure symbol of their culture. For years her purity had been the talk of every household, every gathering. Women admired her for what she represented, and men saw her as the last piece in a puzzle they couldn't solve. They spoke of her as if she were an object, a gift, to be claimed, and all she could do was stand there and smile, the mask of a girl who had no say in her own fate. Zuri's eyes darted across the crowd, catching the familiar faces of her friends, girls who once stood where she did, but were no longer pure in the eyes of the village. Amina, who was once her closest companion, now stood off to the side, her face hardened by years of hardship. Amina's eyes met Zuri's, and for a fleeting moment, there was an unspoken understanding between them. Zuri knew what Amina had been through, how she had been forced into a life of prostitution after her virginity was taken from her, not by love, but by tradition. It was a fate that haunted Zuri, one she couldn't escape, yet one she feared every day. As Zuri scanned the faces, her gaze landed on a stranger, a man she didn't recognize. He was standing just outside the crowd, his eyes locked on her with an intensity that made her heart skip a beat. His dark skin glistened under the sun, and his eyes, sharp and knowing, held a story Zuri was too afraid to understand. He wasn't from the village, she knew that much. His clothes were different, modern, but it was his presence that intrigued her. Unlike the other men who only saw her as a prize to be won, he saw her, truly saw her, as if he knew her pain. Zuri tried to shake the feeling, to focus on the ceremony unfolding in front of her. Mama Adama, the village elder, was speaking now, her voice carrying through the square as she praised Zuri for her purity, for being the last hope of their traditions. "She is the key to our future," Mama Adama proclaimed, her hands raised in blessing. "Without her, our way of life will disappear." The crowd murmured in agreement, their voices low and filled with awe. But Zuri could hear the words for what they truly were. Chains. Amina's face flashed in her mind again. Zuri's heart ached. She remembered the old stories the women whispered behind closed doors, stories of how the village had sacrificed girls like Amina to keep its prosperity alive. The elders had made a pact with the gods. Years ago, sacrifice a virgin, and the village would flourish. It was a tradition that no one dared question, a tradition that Zuri had been raised to uphold. But as the weight of the words settled on her shoulders, she couldn't help but wonder. Was she next? As if answering her thoughts, the man's eyes met hers once more, this time with a hint of recognition. There was a flicker of something. Was it pity? But it was gone before she could decipher it. He stepped forward as if pulled by some invisible force, and the crowd parted to let him throat. Who was he? Why was he here? And why did he make her feel like everything she had ever known was about to crumble? The festival continued, but Zuri could hardly hear the music or the chatter around her. All she could think about was the man, the stranger who had made her question everything. She felt the weight of the elders' eyes on her again, this time more suffocating. They were waiting for her to fulfill her role, to marry the chosen suitor and become the symbol of purity they had built her up to be. But something inside her stirred. Something told her she didn't have to play the part anymore. And just as the thought crossed her mind, the man's voice broke through the silence. "You're not just a symbol," he said, his voice low but firm. "You're a person. You have a choice." And Zuri's heart pounded in her chest. She had never heard anyone speak to her like that before. Everyone had always treated her as a thing to be owned. But this man, this stranger, he saw her as more than that. And for the first time in years, Zuri wondered if there was a way out, if there was a life beyond the village, beyond the traditions that held her captive. But the question remained, was it too late to escape? Zuri didn't know the answer yet, but one thing was certain. The story of the last virgin of the village was only just beginning. The sun dipped lower, casting long shadows across the village square, and Zuri found herself standing frozen, unsure of what to do next. The crowd around her buzzed with excitement, but her mind was elsewhere, lost in the encounter with the stranger. His words echoed in her head, repeating over and over like a prayer. "You have a choice." It was as if he had unlocked a door she didn't even know was there, a door to something bigger, something beyond the dusty roads and the old traditions that had defined her life. And yet, the villagers, on the other hand, were too caught up in the festival's rituals to notice her unease. They continued to cheer, their eyes focused on the sacred dance that had begun at the centre of the square. Zuri, however, could not tear her gaze away from the stranger. His presence was magnetic, pulling her like a force she couldn't fight. He had walked into the square like an intruder, but now he seemed as though he belonged here more than any of them. She tried to shake off the feeling, to focus on the present, but it was impossible. Her life had always been a carefully crafted story, one of purity, tradition, and submission. The villagers had written her future, and Zuri had learned to accept it. Her virginity was her worth. It was the one thing that had kept her safe in their eyes, kept her from being consumed by the darker side of village life. But what if it didn't have to be this way? The man took a step closer, now standing just a few feet away from her. Zuri could feel the weight of his gaze, but he didn't speak. Instead, he simply watched her, as if waiting for her to make the first move. The festival's music played louder now, almost drowning out everything else, but it only heightened the tension between them. Zuri's heart beat wildly in her chest, each thump louder than the last. She could feel the weight of expectation bearing down on her, but now, in front of this stranger, it felt different. He wasn't looking at her like everyone else. He didn't see her as a prize to be claimed. He saw her as a person. The crowd was beginning to grow restless, and Mama Adama's voice rang out over the music. "Let the virgins dance," she declared, her voice booming across the square. The villagers cheered, clapping in rhythm as Zuri and a few of the other girls were ushered to the centre. The dance was a sacred ritual, an offering to the gods, and Zuri knew it all too well. She had performed it countless times before, each step a reminder of her place in the village. The dance was more than just a celebration. It was a test to prove that she was still pure, still worthy of the village's blessings. Zuri felt a strange sense of detachment as she stepped into the circle. The music seemed distant, as though it were coming from another world entirely. The steps were familiar, automatic, and she moved with the rhythm, her body swaying in perfect harmony with the others. But her mind was elsewhere, her thoughts racing, her body aching with a desire to break free. The stranger, still standing on the outskirts of the crowd, watched her intently, his eyes never leaving her. It was as if his gaze had the power to strip away the mask she had been wearing for so long. Zuri couldn't understand it, but she didn't want to look away. There was something in his eyes. A promise, perhaps? Or maybe a challenge. A challenge that said she could be more than just a village virgin. Zuri, a challenge that said she could have a choice. As the dance continued, Zuri felt the pull of her old life slip away, piece by piece. The festival, the elders, the expectations, they all felt like distant memories. Her mind kept returning to the stranger, to his words, and to the quiet rebellion that stirred deep inside her. She wanted to run. She wanted to tear off the veil of tradition that had bound her for so long. She wanted to scream out loud that she was more than just a symbol of purity, more than just a commodity to be bartered for the village's prosperity. But the dance went on. The music swirled, and the rhythm grew faster, more frantic. The other girls moved with ease, their steps as practice as the villagers' beliefs. But Zuri felt lost in the motions, as though she were an outsider in her own life. Her son was going off part of her routine. It was way too slow. And then the moment came. As she twirled, her foot caught on the hem of her dress, sending her stumbling forward into the arms of the stranger. His hands were warm and firm as they caught her, steadying her. The crowd gasped in shock, their eyes now fully focused on the pair. Zuri's breath caught in her throat as she looked up at him. For a moment, time seemed to stand still. The music faded into the background. The crowd's whispers became distant echoes. It was just her and him, standing there in the center of the square, surrounded by centuries of tradition. The stranger didn't pull away. Instead, he looked down at her, his expression unreadable. "You don't have to do this," he said again, his voice low but full of urgency. "You can leave. You don't have to be their puppet any longer." Zuri felt the words sink into her chest like a heavy weight. For a moment, she wanted to believe him. She wanted to run away with him, to escape the life that had been written for her before she was even born. But the reality of her situation crashed down on her. The village would never let her go. She was too important, too sacred, and the cost of disobedience would be far too great. Before she could respond, Mama Adama's voice rang out sharply. "What is this?" The elder's eyes were narrowed, her face twisted in fury. The crowd, sensing the tension, grew silent. Zuri's heart pounded in her chest, but she held her ground. She had no idea what would happen next, but one thing was certain. The world she had known, the life she'd lived, was never going to be the same again. She looked up at the sky and waited, thinking about something for class to end. The days passed quickly, each one bringing Zuri closer to the unknown future she had never dared to dream of before. She learned to trust the stranger, whose name she still didn't know. He had shared little about himself, but she had come to understand him in ways that words couldn't explain. He was kind, but he carried the weight of something darker in his eyes. He had a past, like everyone, but unlike the villagers who were chained to their stories, he seemed to carry his with a quiet strength, as if he had made peace with it. Zuri, on the other hand, felt like she was starting anew like a newborn animal, unsure of where to take its first steps. She felt the sting of her past, the loss of everything she had known. The absence of the village, the elders, the rules they left a hole inside her, but the more time she spent in the jungle, the more she realized that this hole was a space for something else to grow. Something that had always been there, waiting to be set free. The jungle was a strange new world. Wild, untamed, and beautiful in its rawness. The heat, the sounds of the animals, the smell of earth and plants, it was all so overwhelming at first, but it also felt like a welcome escape. Zuri started to learn the ways of the forest. She watched as the stranger gathered fruit, built shelters, and moved with ease through the wilderness. It amazed her how at home he seemed in a place she had never known. One evening, as they sat by the fire, Zuri noticed a change in the stranger's demeanor. He had been quiet for the past few hours, staring into the flames with a far-off look. Zuri, who had grown more comfortable with his silence, didn't push him to speak. But something in her gut told her that now was the moment. Now was the time to finally ask him about the life he had led before all this. "Who are you?" she asked again, this time her voice softer, more pressing. "Where did you come from? Why did you help me?" The stranger let out a deep sigh and looked at her, as if deciding whether to share his story. "I'm not a good man, Zuri," he said quietly, his voice tinged with regret. "I've done things I'm not proud of." Zuri didn't know how to respond to that. She didn't need him to be perfect. She didn't need him to be a hero. She only needed him to be real, to be someone who had given her a chance when no one else would. "I used to be part of a group that sold women," the stranger continued, his words coming slowly. "We used them. Took them from villages, from families, from everything they knew, and we sold them to whoever could pay. But the moment I saw you, I saw something different in you. I saw the same fear. It's the same hopelessness I had seen in so many others. But I also saw strength. Something they couldn't break. Something you couldn't even see yourself."